Yeah, can we talk about that after I get the slides lined up? There's an open mic, and I'm happy to. Why? Were there out of lunches? All right, we'll talk about that. Martin.
Really? Yep. Would that be useful? In my opinion, probably the opposite. But it's like, you want to feed the trolls? Is this you?
Yeah.
Trying to cram some lunch before I.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Might be a meeting.
I don't know what. No, Fred's going to do it. So I don't know why. I know I uploaded them.
You find them somehow?
I don't. I'm like losing my mind.
Let me
Send them. Oh no, I have them. I have them on my machines. Maybe that's just fine. Or we could bring them up.
HDMI. So you're going to have.
And it continues to be really.
That's right. I'll look here and you carry on.
Okay. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So this is the Working Group Chair Forum. This is your Notewell. You've seen it. You all know that. This is still the IETF. So the current agenda is the GitHub for Working Group Chairs discussion. And we had a suggested addition of a Working Group Chair leverage of RFC. And I think we have a couple more topics that are probably going to come up in the open mic that we can add as we get to them. So with no further ado, I'm going to move to the, you can go up there and I can just click for you.
All right. Hello. You may know me from such things as, what is that? Okay, apparently we're talking about GitHub. I apologize, I won't be sticking around for the entire session, so if you have questions, please try to find me. Good luck with that. But email works. So probably as a bit of background here, let's look at Karen's email now, shall we?
So somewhere in Working Group Chair training, they should tell you that it's a really bad idea to chair back-to-back sessions. So.
Wow. All right. So I was going to talk a little bit about our use of GitHub here. Just for interest's sake, how many people are actively using GitHub as part of their working group processes? Oh, wow. Wow. All right. Okay. We're all done here. Thank you. So one of the things I wanted to, a lot of people, if you're not already using it and you don't intend to, perhaps this might change your minds. I'm not actually looking to change minds at this point. I think that one has sailed. One of the things I wanted to talk about was the rationale for doing this. People often talk about, well, why don't we use SVN or GitLab, or why doesn't the IETF maintain their own installation of one of these services? And my response is always the same, which is that GitHub is terrible. It's bad in so many ways, I couldn't even begin to enumerate them. And Git itself is possibly the worst possible tool you could imagine, except for it's like the Churchill statement about democracy. It also happens to be the best thing we've got. And the fundamental reason for that is that is where the community we're trying to reach in a lot of cases actually lives. And so one of the things I found in doing this, I've been doing it for a number of years now, is that the ability to reach a wider audience and a relevant audience is kind of critical to the work that we do here. And this has helped in a huge number of ways. Now, Karen, I'm going to ask you to skip forward quite a number of slides.
I'm happy.
So we're going to talk a little bit about why. Then I've got a few points on some best practices that have emerged, particularly around the management of discussion. That's a particularly thorny problem here because there's a number of ways to do this wrong, and there's some pretty nasty landmines in here. So let's go forward again. So there's a number of things here. Revision control, I shouldn't have to tell people that this is a good thing. Having more transparency about the changes that have been made, when they were made and why they were made, being able to see all of those things is great. Integrating that with issue management is nice. I think the last point is the key point that I wanted to emphasize here, is that this has been hugely successful because of its ability to reach a fairly broad audience. And I don't think that some of the efforts that at least I've been involved in would have been anywhere near as successful if it weren't for that involvement. If we go forward, this is getting truncated, Karen. Do you know? Can you hit the fit to page thing? It's unfortunate. I've picked up the habit of going 4:3, and this. Just go full screen. I don't know what's going on, but it's been cut. Much better, thank you. You'll have a look at Quick, for instance, which is one of the more active things I'm involved in. There's a little number there on the right, it's a bit hard to see, 41 contributors. Next page. This is TLS13, 69 contributors. And some of those are, oh, by the way, I drove by and noticed that he had a typo. And that's kind of nice. What's even better than that is that these are often substantive contributions from people who would not otherwise contribute in this way. And that's been particularly good for TLS. I found it particularly good with HTTP2, and it's proven to be quite useful and quick as well. Next. So we have a bunch of issue management tools here. Issue tracking integrates fairly well. This notion of pull requests is quite handy. The reviewing tools, which are quite frankly awful, they exist, and they're all integrated together, which is kind of handy. Next. You get a nice long list of issues, and you can tag them and wonderful things like that. If anyone picks up this slide deck, all of these things actually link, all the pictures link to the page that's being shown, so you can tool around yourself. I decided we didn't have time for that. Next, please. One of the nice things here is that the issues are effectively threaded discussions, and I've heard a few people comment that this is a little bit difficult to manage. I'll get into more of that later, but each one of these issues has a discussion associated with it, which is the way that some people are used to engaging in these sort of conversations. So you've got to watch for some traps there. Next, please. Pull requests, similar, the list of them. If you go to the next page, there is some code review. And this uses a standard sort of diff display. And people can attach comments to individual changes in the proposed change, and make comments and have discussions and other wonderful things as well. Next. One of the nice things here is that every single change enters a log. It's all visible. You can go back through that history. You can see why the changes were made. You can link those changes up to the issues that drove those changes. And that's nice. And it's also good as an editor to be able to get rapid feedback on these things. So you make a change, that change is immediately visible, and people will look at that change and be able to comment on that immediately. One of the things that we've noticed is that, particularly with the working groups I'm involved with, we maintain an editor's copy, and that's where people go now to make comments. And so we don't have this problem of people coming and discussing the changes that were in the latest draft that have been since superseded by the conversation moving on, changes having been made in the editor's copy, and not having a common shared view of what things are at. Now, that leads to a problem in that there's potential confusion between the two of these things, but generally I've found that it's relatively easy to manage that sort of thing, particularly for those people who are intimately involved in the process. So we maintain a copy of the document. So the question was, what do you mean by an editor's copy? We maintain a copy of the rendered document, so HTML page that contains the text of the latest changes that were made. So the live copy, as it were. So if someone comes in with a comment and we make a change, that change is immediately reflected in that copy. I'll go into that some more later. There's some things I'd like to show. Next, please. As I said before, there's a massive community of people on this website. It's millions and millions. It's kind of absurd. What's nice about that is that large community are all familiar with the tools, and so that makes it much more accessible for communication. Next. All right, so this is the problem part. One of the things that I've observed is that the discussions on issues and pull requests and whatnot has the tendency to sort of fracture. So we're having a conversation over here on the mailing list about something, we're having a conversation on this issue over here, and someone has generated a pull request, and maybe someone has generated an alternative pull request, and those have discussions attached to them, and you can have discussions attached to individual lines of pull requests. So this particular line of the change will have a discussion spawn, and it gets kind of out of hand if you let it. And so this is one thing, whereas chairs, we need to be a little bit careful and understand what sort of modes of interaction we want to encourage, and maybe we want to discourage certain forms of interaction. Next, please. So one of the policies that we started out with in some of these efforts is probably the simplest one, which is that if discussion starts to sprout up all over GitHub, you stomp on it pretty hard and say, we have a working group mailing list. Please use that. Feel free to use GitHub to discuss editorial things, nits, typos, the things that are appropriate for that sort of thing. But please, if you want to talk about actual technical content, please come to our mailing list. And initially you need constant reminders because people's natural sort of tendency is to sort of glom on to whatever has most recently happened. And if you're using the issue tracker to track issues, people will sort of naturally want to respond to that issue and where it appears in their inbox, and they'll reply to the email, and suddenly you're spawning off all of these things. A little bit of due diligence is necessary, but this is a policy that was pretty effective when we first started doing this, and it worked pretty well in HTTP 2, it's worked pretty well for ACME, I know, and it's worked in a number of working groups. Aaron.
So that sounds like a very effective way to handle controversy. There's another kind of discussion, which is to socialize important decisions. It's like in Quick, there was a bunch of topics that were raised today, some discussion on them. Would you drive those to the mailing list as well? And then how do you...
Yeah, I'm about to get into this.
Okay,
Yep.
good, great.
Yep. Hannes.
Martin, is that really true what you said? Like when I look at the DLS discussion, so even things that we talked about yesterday on Quick, with some of the design decisions on and decks on, for example, a connection ID, the response that you gave me, oh, it's somewhere on GitHub. So previously, the barrier of entry for someone making discussions and contribution was
Quick doesn't work this way.
Email.
Quick doesn't work this way.
Okay.
I've got another
And
slide on the
TLS,
alternatives.
Also not, because they like...
I don't know how TLS works. Do we have TLS chairs here? Yeah.
Mahesh, and I think maybe you might be covering this in one of the latest slides, but any way to reflect all the discussion in GitHub on the mailing list directly without having to actually tell people to do it?
Yeah, eventually people learn. And so what happens is after a little while, as the chairs are careful to sort of nudge the conversation back into the places that they'd like to have it, people learn and start helping you nudge it themselves. And so that it actually accelerates. It works out pretty well in the end.
Hi, it's Lou. We looked at taking the notifications that are automatically generated as discussions go on and echoing them to a list. We did that sort of an offline discussion, and we did it to a chairs page, just as a chairs alias, just as a test. And it's just like way too verbose. I mean, it's just like way too chatty to do it to the actual list. If you want to do it to the working group list, you can. But, I think you're insane. But that's
so actually, Lou raises a point that I'm not covering in my slides, and I probably should talk about. The W3C has been using GitHub for a long time, and probably in a far more advanced mode than anything we're talking about here. And they've developed a tool which will reflect certain activity from GitHub onto a mailing list, and you can tune what it echoes. And we currently have, I think it's a weekly synopsis of the things that have happened being echoed into the Quick working group mailing list. We also have a separate mailing list that is the fire hose, and I don't believe anyone subscribes to that one because it is simply unmanageable. One of the nice things about GitHub is that it gives you a lot of tools to manage how notifications come in, and you don't get that with the fire hose. So that's something to keep in mind. There's a tool that's used. You have to install it and run it on some server somewhere, but it effectively automatically runs and generates a summary of saying the following issues were open, the following issues were closed, there were discussion on the following issues, that sort of thing. Hannes. I can dig it up and pass it on if people are interested. Yeah.
And another question, I don't know if you will talk about this, but I noticed that throughout different working groups, they use the process for GitHub usage on the different documents is very different.
Yep.
Some, even within a group, there may be different repositories for different documents, and makes it very difficult to.
Now you're jumping ahead.
And so,
I'm covering this later, so I think we might want to move on unless there's any huge points.
Bernardo, just one comment, which is I'm hoping that at one point you will get to what your recommendations are, particularly with respect, because a lot of these things can be managed by development of tools to be much better than it is today. And I would even characterize the W3C approach as like a too ad hoc, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, your recommendations would be very helpful.
Yep, there's some recommendations further on. I'm not sure that it's going to be comprehensive, but we can continue that discussion. Next. So a number of working groups have sort of migrated to what I think of as a more sort of natural discussion approach, and Quick's certainly taken this approach. HTTP is doing the same. You essentially permit discussion on GitHub. It's always been the case that we take the big stuff to mailing lists and make sure that anything like that has far-reaching implications hits that broader audience. One of the problems, as we discussed, was that you often don't reach the entire working group when you do this, and so this has worked out reasonably well and Quick. It means that you have all of the discussion related to a given issue in the same place. It's a different way of working, so it may take a little bit of time for participants to get accustomed to it, but I found it to work reasonably well. We've learned that having substantive discussion on pull requests is a terrible idea. We actually had one of the pull requests reach the limits of the capabilities of the server, and it would time out when you were the back end would time out, and you would get a nice picture of a unicorn and no content. So be a little bit careful with that one. Next. So my key recommendation here is that, as Bernard pointed out, it is a little bit ad hoc in terms of the process. I don't think that's entirely problematic, but there's a couple of guidelines that are important here. I think it's very important that the working group is involved in the decision to set the policy here. If the working group is not comfortable with the way that you're working, then that's not going to be good. So what I've done and what other groups I've worked in have done has been to send an email to the working group, have a discussion about that, and then document the plan. And you actually have to spend a bit of time monitoring the discussion and following along. GitHub has this contributing document that shows a notice. If you've got the next slide, I think we got a picture of that. So Quick's got a fairly advanced policy and it's quite detailed, but they publish that in a file with a particular name on the repository, and it contains a lot of information about how the working group uses the tool, how discussion is managed, and various things like that. It also contains pointers to the node well and various other things like that. The nice thing is that GitHub will show you a little notice, like you can see on the top there, and that notice is shown to anyone who starts contributing to the group. So if someone wants to open an issue, they see this little notice, and they're encouraged to go and read the guidelines. Of course, the Quick guidelines are enormous, which has all of the problems associated with that. But I think this is kind of the best that we have right now. And anyone who's doing this, I think this is kind of the baseline requirements for getting something set up. It's relatively straightforward to do. It's just that you have to spend the time to set things up. Next. Okay, so I'm going to be even more opinionated here in what I think the established best practices are. You may find you disagree with me. That's fine. It's okay to be wrong. But I'll explain why I think each one of these things is useful, and hopefully go through in a little bit more detail about what sort of things we've got here. Next, please. So the accepted model here, and the one that tends to be used, is that you have a working group, and for that working group, you create an organization. This is essentially GitHub's way of making a team. And what we have here is an example. We have the chairs who own this group. We have an area director who owns this group. So the responsible area director owns the group. And then we have the various document editors also in the organization. And we have a number of repositories under that organization. It's generally what you will find is that individual drafts will be under individual users. But once they migrate to being IETF drafts, it's good to have them moved into this sort of organization so that you have that central place to go. You also have the ability to reassign editors if that is necessary. This is the practice that most working groups that I've been involved with have used. Other people have suggested other models, but this one seems to be working reasonably well. Next. So, as I said, chairs or the responsible AD own the organization. That means they have the ability to set policies and all those sorts of things. They have administrative privileges, essentially. Generally, I recommend that separate work items get separate repositories. I think a mistake that we made in the HTTP working group is to lump all of the work into the one repository. That means that you have a group of north of 15 plus editors all working on the same repository. It's a little clumsy, particularly when it comes to issue tracking, because now you have 15 disparate drafts all in the same issue tracker, and the tools aren't that great when it comes to sorting through that stuff. You need some fairly good discipline about how you manage issues and whatnot when it comes to that. They have a teams thing within organizations that allows you to manage editor groups. That works reasonably well for those drafts that have more than one editor. And you give those teams commit access to the repositories they're responsible for. And my policy as chair, and one I recommend, is that even though chairs have admin privileges in the organization and could potentially change any of the documents, don't do that. It's not your document. That's what we have editors for. Don't touch. And that's generally a good rule.
Hi, Colin Perkins. Should we be granting someone in Secretariat admin privileges?
That has been discussed. I think that's reasonable. And as long, the reason that you want to do something like that is so that you have continuity in case you have people disappear. And so, yes, I would recommend that if you think that's important. Generally, I feel once you have 3 or 4 people who have these sorts of privileges, it's probably okay. But the point has been raised before, and I think it's a fine thing to do. Next. Yes, chairs do not touch. One draft per repository is the easiest thing to do. But sometimes it's necessary to have multiple drafts together because they're interrelated. Text moves between them back and forth. And if you find that if you think that you might be doing that sort of thing, then you probably want them in the same repository. Quick is doing that, and it's awful, but necessary. So, Luke.
Lou, not to make a disruptive comment, but I often do, right? On the prior one about adding on the prior comment about adding Secretariat, I think that should be discussed with the Secretariat before you make it a policy or even make it a recommendation, because there's a cost associated with it.
Sure.
They're not volunteers. So if suddenly we're putting an additional burden on the Secretariat, we should make sure that that's understood what the cost of that is, and there's an agreement that we should be spending money on that.
Well, like I said, I think it would only be as a backstop sort of situation in case your working group chairs went AWOL or something like that. But yeah.
You have working group chairs and ADs there.
ADs change and all those sorts of. I don't think this is particularly important. I haven't seen Secretariat involved in processes so far. So
I'd say let's keep them out unless we really need them.
Okay.
AC Lindo. So how many? I see some of these have everybody who comments on the draft is a contributor and has to be invited to that repository. I definitely agree.
No.
One draft per repository is the only way to go.
Right. So this is one thing I didn't cover.
Okay.
So one of the things that Quick is doing is making a team of people who don't have any right privileges, And that makes it a little bit easier to find those people to assign reviews to and mention and things like that. So that's what we're doing there. It's completely optional. There's no requirement to be part of the organization in order to comment or review or create issues or anything like that. You do have the ability to stop people from opening issues unless they're part of the organization. But that's kind of self-defeating. Next, please. All right, I'm going to say this right now, use Markdown. The reason that we're going here is so that it's easier for people to contribute to your work. Using XML is not really in the spirit of that.
Are you going to say something about archival issues?
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
Well, it's a good point. Next. Back up.
So is MMark or Cramdown being updated for XML to RFC version 3?
Carsten, I believe it is. Or at least Cramdown is. Eventually was the answer. The changes are in some ways small and in some ways fairly significant. So, yes. Sorry to put you on the spot, Carsten. I know you're reading.
So one of the benefits from using Markdown is that you have a stable input format while the transition happens.
Yes. It's also much easier to use, as pointed out. So issue management. At some point, you're going to want to do some of this. And it's very useful to be able to distinguish between stuff that the working group needs to discuss and stuff that the editors have put on the pile just for their own benefit. Typos, if someone's looking for clarification, those sorts of things can often be addressed with editorial issues and they don't need to be discussed in the working group. But knowing what is a design issue is critical. There's also the ability to assign people to review changes, assign people to actually work on things. All of those things together can help you sort through what can turn out to be a fairly large pile of issues in the end. We only have 100 issues left in Quick. That does not count the fact that there was, I think, 1,700 of them closed. So it can get a little bit tiresome. There are other tools here like milestones and a project board, and there are third-party add-ons you can use. It depends on how far you want to get into that. I find that for single draft repositories, simply separating those issues that need discussion from those issues that don't is all you really need to do. A lot of drafts that I've seen have a handful, 5, 10 issues open at any one time, and really you don't need any management at that point. But some are worse than others.
Yaron Sheffer, who's responsible for issues? So on a mailing list, it's eventually the chairs that are responsible for some sort of response. Who's responsible to
Right.
resolve
I
issues?
should get into that. I meant to. So the policy we've adopted in the groups that I'm working in is that the issues are there primarily for the benefit of the editors. Mm-hmm. And so the editors will maintain the issue in the open state until such time as they think they have fixed the problem. Quick has a process that I think is reasonably good in this regard, in that any issue that is tagged design and is closed, the chairs will list out those ones that have been newly added to that pile when a new revision of the draft has been issued by the editors, and they will explicitly ask the working group, the following changes have been made, long list.
On the old style mailing list.
And on the mailing list, and they will say, we would like to confirm that there is consensus on these things. It's like a mini last call on those things. And that allows us to collect the sort of final feedback on those things. And they'll actually tag those things once that process has been completed. And that's probably necessary given the sort of nature of the discussion there. That's something that I think the chairs will have to work out. It's usually part of the contributing policy. Dave.
So Dave Taylor. So I chair the TEEP working group, which plans to start using this. So I'm part of your core audience. We're not using it yet, and I'm here to learn how to use it in the way that the IETF commonly we want to use things. My question is about the design label. Is that a GitHub concept, or is that something that every working group creates a label and design as a convention? Is design the same thing as technical, or is there a distinction between design and technical? Is this a convention? You're saying every
This is a
working group
convention.
should use the label design and create a label design,
Okay.
as opposed to creating a label technical? Are all the working groups that you mentioned, CAPPORT and HTTP, are they all using the word design, or what? So
This
what
is a
should
con-
I do as a working group chair?
This is an emerging convention. I'm not sure that there's any hard and fast rules here, but GitHub allows you to create labels and put whatever color you want on them. By convention, a lot of the groups have started using this particular distinction, but that's just
And it's synonymous with technical, meaning
technical. It
editorial
means
and design or alternatives?
yes, they're alternatives.
My brain just said to me, and Carsten, we need to agree on a color code between working groups. I'm absolutely serious.
Okay, so anyone who wants to use labels other than these should have a very good reason for it, is my thing, because we have a lot of groups using exactly those labels, and by which I mean the RGB is the same.
Tommy, yeah. So I think we have an opportunity for some of our other groups to try to conform more to that. For example, instead of design, we use discuss, which I think is more of like, you should do this, as opposed to we've done design and administrative. But I think aligning would make sense.
Yeah. So one of the insights here is that you can try to change these things, but it's probably better just going with the flow in this case. That's part of the reason why we're using GitHub, is that it's going with the flow. Hey, Rich.
Hey, so the GitHub API is pretty awesome. You have a script to
Yeah.
that does all this?
Yeah, you could do that.
No. Yeah, fine. Okay. No, I was asking you when you have one.
So the tools that I maintain are on GitHub, strangely enough. Anyway, we'll get to that later on. Next, please. So having your draft on GitHub is awesome. Next.
Hi, Francesca. Just as an author, since we're using this, I think for the labels or issues, we actually use it also to label on which version the issue was opened. And I think this is really useful. So
yep.
That can be.
If that works for you, that's great. I've not found it necessary in the groups that I'm working in, but some people might find that really handy. So reading XML is terrible. Next. So continuous integration systems are primarily designed to check that your code is still good for whatever purpose you've designed it for. And so we have now got tools that exist to both check that the draft is valid, but we've also subverted those tools in order to use them to maintain the editor's copy that we were talking about before. Next. So, where did that go? So we have this is the quick README. It's a little bit out of date. But you'll notice here that the drafts we have, there's a section for each one of them, and there are 3 links there. And the first one of those links to the editor's copy of the document. I think it's on the next page. So we have a document. It's HTML. It's readable. It's probably more nicely formatted than any internet draft that you'll find. And that reflects the current state of the master branch of the repository. And so that updates live as a result of you having made a commit. I think it takes about 40 seconds now. I think we got it down to that point for the whole thing to go through. And so that's a nice property. If you manage to screw up your commit and break the draft, which is surprisingly easy, it will send you an email and you get to fix it. We use this for pull requests to check that the pull request is syntactically valid. So it'll report on that and on the pull requests. Niels?
Niels Tenover, do you have a how-to for this?
There are detailed instructions. We're coming to that, I think. Next, please. One of the things this maintains is a page that shows all of the different documents. And so you can get access to the plain text version of the draft, the HTML version of the draft, diffs, and various other things like that. There's a bunch of other things. Someone mentioned archival. This is your archive right here. And so all of this is actually maintained on a separate branch in the repository. And one of the things that this toolchain manages is it saves a copy of all the issues and pull requests into the repository every time it does this. And so there's a little link there that actually you can look at the saved issues and scroll through them. And that's actually something that works offline as well. You can switch to that branch and you can... The last submission to the IETF. So it actually goes off to the data tracker and looks at the last version. You'll notice here that it also shows previews for different branches. So if you have editors working on a draft and they're working on different branches for different changes, you can actually get a preview of those changes right here as well. And so all of that information is right there. It's really useful, particularly as an editor when you want to present a big change in front of someone. This automatically gets generated when you push one of these branches up there. And so you can say, oh, and by the way, if you want to have a look at this, here's the link, and you can review that. You can always look at the pull request that's been generated and go through the actual code changes, but it's sometimes nice to be able to have a look at the draft and go through that in detail. There's a bunch of other things that are involved in this process, but this is basically it. Next, please. Right, so the toolchain is up on GitHub. It does a number of things. It's got simple commands for building the changes, which is kind of handy. It integrates with the continuous integration thing. It validates the changes and generates these previews and saves all the issues into the repository and does all of that. One of the things that continuous integration allows us to do is automated submission. So one of the multi-moving part processes in all of this is submitting a draft to the tracker. In this case, it supports a mode where you create a tag with the draft name and number that you would like to have created, and you push that tag up into GitHub, and continuous integration will submit it to the data tracker for you. It does all that automatically. And that means that your repository now has a tag that identifies the state of the repository when you generated that draft, and it matches up perfectly at that point. It also does things like produce diffs and that doesn't even make sense. But it manages issue status and things like that. Custom.
Yeah, I came here to sing the praises of this. One thing I've recently noticed is that there is now a commit hook that mysteriously breaks on all the laptops of all presenters, contributors, and
it installs a commit hook, yes, which will check the things that you're trying to commit to make sure they build.
Yes.
Yes.
And that checking always breaks.
Okay. Well, you can open an issue.
I will. I just wanted to know whether that's a bug or a feature, and yeah.
Well, it sounds like a bug, but it might actually be a feature.
So only people can contribute to the IETF who have working configurations on their laptops. That maybe makes sense.
So one of the things you can do, I didn't think we had time to go through, but the contribution process via GitHub itself is, you can just go to the web page and there's an edit button on the page. I think if we go back about 10 slides, there's the picture of the XML there's a button there. Oh, there's a little pencil button in the top corner. You can just edit that right there. That doesn't run all the CI stuff. That doesn't run the commit hook because the commit hook is something that runs locally. I'd be interested to learn what's going on there, by the way.
The integrating back into the tracker.
Yes.
Is there a reason you did it as like a separate step with a label as opposed to like going back into the trunk is moving it to the tracker? Design choice, or there's a...
Yeah, it was an explicit choice. We wanted to make sure that the master branch reflects the current state of thinking.
The current state of the editors and...
The current state of the editors. One of the things that we've realized is that the primary user of this is the editors of the document, and whatever's reflected in the state in GitHub, in the repository, needs to reflect what the editors need. Yep. And so tags are quite nice for that anyway. The notion of using a tag for a release is actually baked into all of this anyway, so that makes the most sense. Barry,
can the editors use this offline, like if they're on planes and stuff?
This works reasonably well offline. If you're using Cramdown, for instance, it maintains a cache of all the references that you have. If you are maintaining your own copy of the bibxml stuff, you can actually do a ton of work that way. Unfortunately, if you want to add a new reference, it's a little bit tricky because that's hard. There's some options in the Cramdown tool that'll let you work offline anyway, but they kind of kludgy.
Not 100%, but a lot.
Most of this, almost all of this, you can do offline.
Okay.
And one of the
get back online, it all spreads up.
You use the standard git push pull stuff and everything's fine. Nothing other than building the drafts needs to go online typically. Yep.
Stuart Bryant. So if a new group decides they want to do this with all the CI stuff and all that, how do they get started? I mean, is there a sort of...
There are documents on that repository that are linked to in the README, and they explain in some detail on how to use it.
So there's sort of an idiot's guide if I go in there and it will tell me all the things I need to do.
Yes.
Good, thank you.
Mahesh, I don't know if you plan to cover how code or code snippets get inserted into the draft and how they are managed separately from the draft.
Yeah, good question. That differs between the authoring tools. I think MMark has a different process to how Cramdown might manage that as well. That's probably something more for those people. One of the nice things with this is you can put the code right next to the text. And a couple of drafts I have sample code, and they do that. But ultimately, I think I've ended up copy and pasting the code into the draft as necessary if that was what I was going to do. That's not ideal. I know that MMark has an include statement. I think Cramdown does as well, but I've never used it. So
open brace : include.
There we go. Really easy.
Right. So just to add to that, we found this particularly useful for Yang.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And we have tools that actually allow you to include the files that are maintained separately in GitHub into the draft.
Yep. And so that would be possible. One of the nice things with doing something like that is that if you have an automatic validation process, you can integrate that into the checking of the draft. And so if you're using the continuous integration system, you get reports on whether your Yang is valid, which I think is a pretty useful thing.
So if you look at RFC 7400, there are lots of examples in there, and these examples have text explaining what they do. This text was automatically generated during CI. So you can do a lot of things to make your work easier that way. You don't have to write everything that goes into the RFC.
So one of the things that I've done is there's a draft in TLS that I have that generates example messages. And that's all actually generated in CI, the entire draft, all the test vectors. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to do it. It's 60 pages of hex, so I'm not doing that. Next. I think that's right. Yeah, we're not going to have that time for that. So that's more information. I did publish a draft a little while ago that sort of goes through some of this stuff. There's a link to that there. It's well expired now, but by the miracle of GitHub, it's still there. Pete.
So you talked a little bit earlier about the fire hose, which most working group mailing lists that are really active are indistinguishable from fire hoses anyway.
Not
really,
like this.
Yeah, really.
Not like this.
So there's no level of tuning that you could make to make it go back and forth in a happy way other than summary of issues.
I'm sure there are probably some ways we could address this with tooling, but it is kind of amazing, yeah. Everyone who's tried it has turned it off.
Andy Malice, is anyone concerned about the fact that that the IETF is becoming dependent on a resource that's not under our control, which is GitHub.com? And has there been any thinking about hosting our own repositories on our own servers or anything like that?
So I touched on that briefly. Yes, there are people concerned about this. I'm surprised that no one's gotten up to beat me around the head for the fact that they don't do V6. But there, as I said, this tool is.
Didn't pay for the second half hour?
Andy
Mouse. So this tool is awful, but it's where everyone is. And most of the benefit we gain is from going to where everyone is. And yes, we could host our own one of these. GitLab is available. It's just dead. It's no battery. We'll sort it out later. GitLab does this, and we could host our own, but we'd lose all the benefits that we're looking for. Because frankly, a lot of these tools are not very good apart from the fact that they have the community that's there. And of course, we'd also lose the continuous integration stuff unless we built our own. And some of those other things sort of flow on from that, but yeah.
Okay, thanks. I guess we'll just pass this back and forth. So as in most cases where it comes up in my life, I find tags really confusing because it is so open. And so you talked about, you made a few statements, and I want to just make sure I understand correctly. One, there's the design and editorial, which you said strongly recommended, and I believe you implied that the convention is in use more broadly than just the IETF community, but it's sort of a GitHub kind of standard. And then the other thing I wanted to ask, or maybe suggest if the answer is no, is there a suggested list of tags? Because it seems like there's a bunch of conventions here, and have everybody invent their own is going to just shift this problem from those two tags to a bunch of other tags. I want a help page.
Yeah, we don't have a help page for any of that right now, but the convention is IETF convention. People use different conventions in other groups, and certainly the conventions that we need are different to those that might be used, for instance, on an open source project. They have different needs and different timescales and all sorts of other things like that. But I think we should probably write something down on that front, and having, use this color or having a script that just populates the repo with the right things is probably a good thing to do. Yeah.
Hi, David Skinazi. First off, seriously, thank you for building these tools. They look amazing. Thanks. So then the next logical thing is I want to use this. It sounds amazing. Right now, a lot of my draft authors kind of run their own repo, and I want to encourage this as a better way to collaborate to get more people to contribute to our documents. But right now, these repos don't have a README, don't have a contributing, no mention of the note well anywhere, and that kind of worries me because I think that should be there, like you discussed. These working groups has those. Could we have some guidance, maybe from our IETF lawyer, on how to do this right? I want to be covered, so everything's covered by the note well, and I don't have to worry about it.
So there was some discussion a little while ago. That's David. The discussion a little while ago about what we needed to do, and I believe the ISG did actually consult the lawyer and produced some text. This tool here, the tool that I maintain, actually contains that text. And so if you use it, there's a setup process that will generate a README that looks very much like the quick one that you saw there. It generates a contributing thing. I don't think it has a license as well that points to the right place. So a lot of that setup stuff is done for you. And the fact that people aren't using that is probably, reflective of the fact that we embrace all comers, and we can't really make everyone use this, but it's certainly encouraged.
No, thanks. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Perfect.
Carsten, I have 2 minor points. One thing as a working group chair you may want to do is actually pull in drafts that are not yet working group drafts to the working group's repository. So you don't have this. Usually the adoption is something where a lot of other things happen and so on. You don't want this to be the time when the author is getting familiar with how to use the working group repository. So we pull in stuff early. We try to make sure the README says this is still an individual submission, but it's really useful. The other thing I wanted to quickly comment on the issue, what happens if the new owner of GitHub decides to destroy it? I think we have to be aware that this is very much a possibility. But I am relatively happy about the current situation because I know there is an alternative. It's not as good. It doesn't have the crowds yet, but there is something called GitLab, which is good enough. I mean, it's not great, but it's good enough. We use it for Bitbucket is another competitor. GitLab has the advantage that you can run it on your own. So if the IETF at some point decides they want to run their own infrastructure for this, it's easy to do, and 95% of this stuff continues to just work.
Yeah, and so part of the reason that I copy issue status into the repository is so that at least we don't lose the topics. It doesn't copy everything in there because that's a massive amount of information, but it copies issues. Thanks. And so if GitHub went away tomorrow, all the editors would have a copy of all the code, all of the history, all of the issues, and you'd have multiple copies of that anyway. So we've got a pretty good backup strategy as well.
AC Lindum, I just, we're not using this, but we're using a lot of individual repositories. And I heard something that you'd change when the draft changed from non-working group to working group. I think it'd be better just to have a generic name for it for both types and just maintain the continuity across have one repository per draft and just name it without anything that would imply working group or non-working group.
That's what people do. Yes. Yes.
Do you have, Dave Waltermeyer, do you have any instructions on how to migrate from some arbitrary Git repo with issues into the environment that that your tooling uses?
Yes. On that page.
Awesome.
So, Martin, I don't know if you're watching the time, but you're...
I am acutely aware of the time.
Okay. So I think that brings us to a close here, brings Martin's portion of this to a close. Thank you.
Thank you.
I will say that the first person that sent me slides for this meeting well in advance of the meeting was Martin, and apparently the only ones I did not put online are Martin's. And the Chromebook works a lot better when the slides are in the materials, I'll have to say. It worked really well in my previous meeting. So we have about 4 minutes for open mic. So I don't know. Okay, you can be quick. Okay, so Aaron, you're first.
Hi, Aaron Falk. So to recap the message I sent out to the working group chairs list earlier, I think most of you know that I'm running a lightning talk series on Sunday evenings called Hot RFC, and the idea is to have a very low bar of submission for people who want to talk about an idea and find folks who want to collaborate on it. I think I've gotten some positive feedback. I haven't gotten any negative feedback. If you have negative feedback, please send it my way, because my current perception is that it's a pretty good idea and pretty successful. I'd like to continue it. My sense is that, or my experience is that occasionally random stuff shows up in working groups by people who have new drafts and they're trying to find a taker for it. And they, especially people who come from outside the IETF, they don't really know where to go. This is a good place to help those people find their community, especially if they don't know what area or they're, it's too broad. It's help them meet folks who understand the IETF, who can give them some direction. So, I'm here to ask for your help. If you see an opportunity like that, whether it's on the IETF list or in your working group, you can send them to, you just direct them to me, and I've been doing a different page for each IETF, but I think we may just come up with a standing thing at some point. But you get 4 minutes, and you talk to, probably 100, 150, maybe 200 IETFers. So it's the idea. It can be pre-draft. The idea is just to help folks get things going. Or if somebody's running a barb off and they're trying to get the word out, basically the problem is that nobody reads the IETF list anymore, and so we've become kind of fragmented into our little sub lists. And so if you want to try to reach a bunch of people, one of the challenges that I've been having is trying to let people be aware of this. So please tell folks about it. If you think somebody's got some questions on it, you can just send them directly to me. If you go to the main IETF page for this meeting, how IETF102 and /hot RFC, then you'll get the page for this, or I can send you the link. Thank you. And if you have any feedback, find me offline. No reason to do an open mic now because we're running out of time.
Okay. 30 seconds. Anybody else who has like 30 seconds or less on topics, just introduce your topic and then discuss it on lists. Please get in the line.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Skenazi, Chair of DNS Service Discovery. My co-chair, Tim Chown, is stepping down. So he's been absolutely amazing for many years, but I am looking for a new co-chair. So if someone in the room wants a second working group or knows someone that could be a good fit, please reach out to me. We haven't found a replacement yet. Thanks.
All right. The one thing that somebody did mention to me in advance, and I'll take this to the list, is we didn't do lunch reservations this time. We didn't do a reservation system this time. There's just so many things that you register for. And it turns out that I guess some of you think we should. So we'll take it to the list, ask if there's a better way of doing this. So we ran out of vegetarian? Non-vegetarian. Okay. So maybe we still need to do it. So, in any event, take your garbage. Thank you. Comment on the list. Thanks.